there are any questions, things that people have been thinking about since last week. Yes, Marilyn?
I'm just looking over the midot, and I know there's not enough time to go through all of them, but the one with the explanation that kind of felt I wasn't really getting was bitachon is trust. Like what does that mean in the Mussar world of the midot? Does it, no.
It's a good question. So let's see if we can, Rabbi Russell can put the list of midot up. And we'll take a quick look at that. Okay, so let's go to trust. So it says, if worry comes to your heart, take it as a warning from God who loves you. Examine your deeds and take counsel with those whose advice you seek. When you have fulfilled God's will, trust God and your serenity will return. So essentially, Marilyn, this is a kind of deeper, a deeper expression of savlanut, right? So if savlanut is when you can't do anything about something, don't add to the problem with wasted grief, then this is a somewhat more positive spin on that, right? That is, when something upsets you, your first response to it is going to be to protect yourself, to go into a kind of hardening of your nefesh, therefore creating Yetzer Hara energy. But if you think of it as a warning, as one of my co-teachers in the center calls it a wind chime, right? You hear something, and instead of hardening, first take a look at yourself and what you may have contributed to the situation. Then seek good advice. And when you've done everything that you can do, let it go. Right? So, often we translate bitachon also as, sometimes we translate it as faith. We translate it as, what else? Security, I guess, on some level, right? So all of those things, I think, are somewhat involved.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. So what I want to focus on today, for the first part of the session, is on the idea of Torah study. And I hope that everyone had a chance to, let's see if I can figure out how to do this right. My share screen is not working. I can't share my screen.
You are sharing. We just saw your lovely grandchildren, and now we're seeing your Zoom. And now we see your lovely grandchildren again.
All right, so I got to find out where my...
Which one are you looking for? 3?
Just a second. No, that's no good. I'm looking for Torah as a spiritual garment.
Yeah, I see the tabs at the top. So at the very top, you see it's where it says session 3 handout. I can see it from here. So just go click on there you go.
Thank you.
Yep. I also can do it if it's easier for you from here.
Oh, thank you. Once I get my bearings, I think I'll be okay. All right, so I don't know that we really need to have this up on the screen anyway, because we're not going to read it all together. But my question really was, how many people have had a chance to read this? And again, if so, I would encourage some comments or questions.
Rabbi, I had a question about Torah Lishma as solicitous, the second to the last line is this solicitousness of the other that distinguishes Torah Lishma from the other modes of learning. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And the other thing was that in this, moreover, the text we are studying contains a history of such encounters, and specifically to what that referred.
Okay, great questions. I'm going to put them off for a second, just so that we get our bearings in the text here. So basically what we're saying, what I'm saying in this piece are a couple of things, right? Number one, that I want people, well, let me back up. What I want to establish is that Torah study, and a particular kind of Torah study, is central to the larger concept of Mussar. That is, I really want to be clear that Mussar is a modality, if you will, of traditional Jewish spirituality, and it can't be cut off, right? It isn't just about studying midot, though of course midot are going to be very important, but rather situating oneself within the worldview of Torah, right? So that's number one. And having done that, then I want to suggest that the central principle of Torah, which I think is not arguable, is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself. And then the next step is that I want to suggest, and I didn't make this up, I've drawn it from traditional sources, that learning Torah is not merely, and maybe not even mainly, an informational pursuit, right? But rather is a process for transforming personality. And that in that context, in fact, Torah is seen not as a text, but as a spiritual phenomenon, right? Now stop me if I get too, if I go too far down the rabbit hole and you can't follow, right? But basically what I'm saying is that the written Torah and the oral Torah, the historical documents that we call Torah, are a reflection or a response to an existential experience that is larger than those documents, right? And that experience is translated by human beings into the text of the Torah, to the text of the tradition, including the mitzvot, right? So Torah is an existential experience. And that existential experience is the recognition of the obligation to love your neighbor as yourself, right? And then in order for that experience to adhere to one's soul, one must prepare one's soul through the cultivation of midot. So midot, in a certain sense, precede mitzvot, You don't do mitzvot to be a better person, to put it crassly. You are a better person, therefore you do mitzvot. Because the mitzvot are the concretization of the insight of loving your neighbor as yourself, etc. Right? So, so that's number two. That Torah is a spiritual garment, that in order for that spiritual garment to have transformative impact on a person, it has to, quote unquote, adhere to them, and it adheres to them through the cultivation of their midot. And as it adheres to them, the content is created by them in the form of mitzvot and halacha, right? So we do mitzvot because we have already cultivated our midot. And then the next stage of the article talks about the process that this takes. And the process, as I said, starts with midot. Once one cultivates midot, then one transforms oneself into a receptacle for Torah, for mitzvot, for halacha. But the specific mode of Torah study that Jewish tradition highlights is not by accident an interactive mode, in which learning always takes place in dialogue with another person. Now we're getting to your question, Sanford, right? So the fact that we study Torah face to face impacts the Torah that we study. There's a human being on the other side of our study session, as it were. And that human being's feelings, experiences, etc., influence the content of the Torah that we're studying. And so therefore, studying Torah by oneself is in a certain sense counterproductive or solipsistic, because it only has to appeal to one side of the conversation, your side. It becomes self-referential rather than dialogic. Right? So the other person with whom I study Torah is a person that I have to be solicitous of. I have to hear. I have to be aware of how this Torah is impacting that person. And that in itself is a model for what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, so to speak. So that's what I mean, learning is solicitousness of the other, places it at the heart of the Jewish spiritual journey.
And what about the text we are studying contains a history of such encounters?
Yes. So in particular, of course, the classic curriculum for Jewish study is Talmud, or the various rabbinic offshoots, right, even Midrash, in which when one is studying the text, one is already in dialogue with the person who is the speaker of the text. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Shmuel, right? That, in other words, Judaism has arranged itself so that it's actually impossible to study a text by yourself, because you're already involved in a dialogue from the moment you open the book. It may not be a living dialogue in this particular case, but there is, as it were, another person present, right? And so that's what I mean by the history, right? When you're studying the text of the Talmud, you're in conversation, as it were, with the classical rabbinic sources. Okay. So because of this, our program places text study on really an equal basis with the study of midot and with the cheshbon hanefesh process that we talked about last week. So to do cheshbon hanefesh, as important as it is, to be aware of the midot and to study and practice them, as important as it is only one half of the process, right? An engagement with this historic model, preferably amplified with a chavruta partner, becomes equally important. Okay. So that's why I gave you this text to look at today. Questions?
I see you have a hand in the participants. Gary is raising his hand.
Gary,
Yeah,
I got
so the
you.
thing that jumps out at me right there when you're talking about midot precedes chavruta is Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, where we tend to defer right away to Hillel, and Hillel was always more, I think in almost every case, more lenient than Shammai. And with that, is that a way of endorsing that as saying they were more likely to have more compassion, being more observant to midot and looking at the evaluation of halacha than Shammai might have been, and it kind of endorses that approach of always taking others' opinions under consideration. Is that a retroactive way of doing that and recognizing that machloket?
I mean, I think that what it recognizes first and foremost is the fact that there was a dialogue, right? So Hillel and Shammai are aware of each other's presence, at least as far as the text is constructed, right? Whether or not it is endorsing the taking a more lenient view of the halacha or not, maybe, but I think it's more important that it endorses the dialogic model than that it endorses the specific way in which the law was decided. Remember that Hillel and Shammai did not make up the rule that Hillel is always right. Right? If you ask Shammai is always right. Right? It's the later rabbis in the Talmud who, in order to figure out what to do with these machlokot, came up with the rule that said, in all but a few cases, we follow Hillel. And so I'm not sure that we can attribute that level of compassion to Hillel himself, right? Okay. Any other questions? Let me just check here. Does anybody else have their hand up? I don't see anybody.
Rabbi,
yeah.
just one more thing. Will you be talking more about this? Because I've started a chavruta study about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And the difficulty is exactly how to conduct that. I'm not a sage and my partner is well-versed and not a sage, but do we bring up topics and see how did this affect you emotionally? What did this interest you? Will you be talking later on in future sessions about exactly how one does this rather than going back and forth the way Nechama Leibowitz would? You don't have to answer it now. I know you have much more to do.
No, that's okay. This is the right time to ask that question, right? Because I don't really anticipate that we're going to go into this much after this. Yeah, I think that the beauty of the chavruta experience is that it should be one in which everything that the text elicits from the participants is fair game for conversation. So if the text makes you feel uncomfortable, if the text makes you feel angry, if the text reminds you of something else, if the text inspires something, if you get off topic, right? A really good chavruta doesn't worry about how much text they finish in a day, but how enriching the experience of studying the text with each other is. So I don't know if that answers your question completely, but that's how I would answer it. Dara, you have a question.
I'm remembering something, I think, from one of Rabbi Russell's classes, and I hope I'm correct, but please correct me. Going back to Gary's question about Hillel and Shammai, wasn't it true that the Hillel school always presented the opposing view as part of their discussion? And isn't that sort of a model of this dialogue that, that we're talking about?
Well, I would defer to Rabbi Russell. If she said it, it's probably true. But, you know, this will probably get me off on a tangent that I'm not sure I really want to go on. But the history of the text, you know, Hillel and Shammai did not construct the text in which we find them. Right? So really, when we're talking about Talmudic texts, or even in particular, we're talking about texts that were edited hundreds of years after the participants may or may not have said exactly what they said. So, so I'm more likely to not worry about what Hillel or Shammai actually thought or said, but rather to ask myself, what did the editor want to model in setting up this conversation between Hillel and Shammai? And in that sense, I think it fits right into what we're saying. Somebody decided that Hillel and Shammai would be positioned to model what a good chavruta would look like, right? And then so the important part for us is to learn that when you're in conversation with another person, you have to be able to hear their opinion, right? You have to be able to consider it respectfully. Okay. In the course of this article, I also mentioned it briefly, and so I want to just highlight that before we leave it, that, and I want to repeat it because it's a little bit of a different approach, right? And learning begins with emulation, but requires introspection and conscientious steps towards self-transformation, right? In the course of this process, as Torah more and more adheres to our souls, the specific content of Torah, the mitzvot and the halachic and agadic discourses, become the field upon which our Torah-bearing souls express themselves in concrete acts. Right? So, I mean, this is worded very carefully because I want to make sure that at least you're aware of my approach, whether you agree or not, which is that the content of what we call Torah is a human creation, a response to an existential experience of transformation precipitated by the refinement of our soul, as it were, by virtue of the midot. And then as we refine our soul, we as a people developed instrumentalities to maintain that refined state. Those instrumentalities come in two flavors, so to speak. Mitzvot ben adam lamakom, and mitzvot ben adam lachavero. Mitzvot between people and God, so to speak, and between people and people. The mitzvot ben adam lechavero, those mitzvot which are between people, actually contain the ethical principles that we derive from our midot work, right? Visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, taking care of the poor. Those are mitzvot which are direct corollaries of midot. The mitzvot that we call ben adam lamakom are what I call interruptive mitzvot. They derive from our realization that unless we keep ourselves awake to our responsibility to the others, we will inevitably forget it. And so we have a class of mitzvot that are interruptive. They are what we used to call ritual mitzvot, right? They are acts that do not in and of themselves contain ethical content, but their ethical content is contained in the fact that they interrupt our self-absorption. They remind us that we have obligations to others. And therefore, this approach to Torah study also undergirds our commitment to halacha, and just as importantly, serves as a critique of halacha, so that when certain ritual mitzvot, which may have been invented in a particular historical period as interruptives, when they themselves become oppressive, then we are free to change them, right? In order to make them consistent with the ethical principles that undergird them. And so this is an approach to a changing, growing approach to halacha, which I think is particularly comfortable for those of us in the conservative movement, and supplies those of us in the conservative movement particularly with a rationale that makes more sense than simply the fact that we're modernizing. So I wanted to just point that out. Okay. Rabbi Russell, if you would stop sharing. Was this me? Yes.
That's
okay.
you.
Sorry.
No worries.
So I have to get, how do I get?
There should be a big thing on the top that says stop in red.
Yeah. But I wanted to move to something else, so I have to find it. All right, let's try this.
You have 5 open at the top. Yeah, that works too.
Okay.
Can you, there's been some requests to make it a little larger. See the little plus sign on the bottom? Would help people, I think. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that's kind of the Torah study session, that section of today's shiur. All right. All of our sessions are divided between a shiur and a vad. And the shiur is on a classical text. The classical text that the 2 classical texts that constitute the basic curriculum for the Center for Contemporary Mussar are Mesilat Yesharim, Paths of the Upright by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And the second text that we get to later in the program is called Tomar Devorah, The Palm Tree of Deborah by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Right, so these are the 2 texts that we study in great detail. And I'm going to, hopefully today, we'll send out an email with an excerpt from Mesilat Yesharim that we can use as our Torah study for next week. Right? So the second part of the session is always a vad, where we talk about the actual work that we're doing. So before I go into the practice here, let me just ask whether any of you had the chance to either keep a journal or at least think about the middah that we introduced last week of metinut, of deliberation, and whether people would like to share any time that particular middah came into play at a particular moment in their thinking about their behavior during the past week? I can't see everybody at once, but I'm not seeing any hands going up. Oh, Marilyn, you want to share with us? Maybe Rabbi Russell can
So
pause
just
the
to,
recording.
so you want to,
Your husband said this, and you responded by saying something not very nice to him. And now it's a little bit later on in the day, and you're doing your cheshbon nefesh, and you ask yourself, what was I afraid of? And you realize there's nothing really to be afraid of in that situation. And so then you ask yourself, what middah could I have used to have avoided this situation? And you come up with metinut and maybe some of the other midot, right? And then you ask yourself, will I be able to do this? Can I internalize this so that next time I will be able to react differently, right? So the process is to learn through reflection in order to eventually be able to access those skills in the moment, to build what you might call muscle memory, right? I don't really have to defend myself from my husband because even if he yells at me, he's not going to kill me. Now, of course, there are husbands that are dangerous. We're not talking about that, right? We're talking about the normal give and take of a relationship in which there is an undercurrent of love and concern, and we can depend on that, right? And therefore, we don't have to close ourselves off, right? So it's about learning to build a muscle memory, which is precisely what cheshbon nefesh is all about, right? Being able to experience immediately that sense of closure and transform it, right? Okay, great, good example. So now what I want to do is look a little bit at some of the other tools in the Mussar toolbox that, if this were a full-scale program rather than just a seeds introduction, we would be focusing on in the course of the practice, right? So you have this piece here called Foundations of the Practice, which comes from our proprietary textbook, which we call Cultivating Your Soul. And I'm going to kind of skip the introduction, although actually the first paragraph is very appropriate at this moment, because what does it say? Think about the moment when the shofar is sounded on Rosh Hashanah, which is a moment, of course, that is coming quite soon. Hopefully, you'll have an opportunity to actually hear the shofar this year. I don't know how your synagogue is doing it. I know here in Philadelphia there are going to be shofar blowings in public parks, and one synagogue has somebody who's standing on the roof and you can drive by and hear the shofar blow. I mean, there are all kinds of 2020 solutions to the problem of hearing the shofar this particular year. But no matter how you hear it, the idea is sleepers awake. And in that spirit, Mussar asks, are you awake? Sure, you're reading this book, but are you really awake, right? So we talk about a centuries-old toolbox, and let's get down to the tools, right? The first tool, which is essential to Mussar, is deciding to adopt a daily spiritual practice, right? Now, on some level, for many of us, this is, let me call it, somewhat unusual, right? We don't think of Judaism as requiring a daily spiritual practice. Of course, somewhere I think we know that it does, because we know that for centuries Jews have every day prayed 3 times a day, or put talis and tefillin on every day, or done other such daily spiritual practices. But for many of us, those have lost their power, their meaning. And so our Judaism becomes limited, if you will, to when we go to shul, or if we go every week, or sometimes we go a couple of times a year, whatever it is. But we don't think of it in the same way as we imagine other religious traditions have, what we would call a daily spiritual practice. But Mussar requires that we make and follow through on a commitment to ourselves as the vehicles through which we respond to and bear the others in our lives as our responsibility. The real work of Mussar depends on daily physical action, sitting, writing, studying, reading, and talking with others. Right? When people first practice Mussar, these habits often seem difficult, sometimes impossible. Beginners express doubt that they will be consistent. Initially, this is a fine response. It takes time to get used to the idea that a Mussar discipline exists and that it works. It is the very work of establishing a daily discipline that allows us to do the work of Mussar. Through the practice of Mussar, we learn about our inclination to open up or close ourselves off from the other, which is the main goal of early Mussar study. So reflect on that for a minute, right? Let me ask whether anybody has a reaction to that idea that this practice is a daily, habitual, spiritual practice of taking account of our behavior and our actions. Is this something that makes sense, seems reasonable, seems difficult, seems irrelevant?
There are more than a few of us in this room who actually who understand that in a way, because like in some ways going to Minyan, having a regular prayer practice, which, where this, luckily for us, and I'm blessed to have like a community that does honor that. So I think that this is a room where there are a lot of people who really would feel that and see that, because I would think in some ways, like having morning prayers, that's that space. Yes.
Absolutely. I'll get back to that, Todd.
Yeah, I just the idea of daily practice, that seems central to Judaism. The spiritual part is to some extent the challenge, the historical challenge of Judaism, connecting it, the practice to something beyond. But when I think about that list of 5 things, I was wondering, where is eating? It feels like eating is a tremendous, daily practice, and Judaism is all about making that into a spiritual practice.
Okay, so that's a great point. 2 points plus Marilyn's point, so we have 3 points. Number 1, yes, I would say that the daily prayer service in its origin, going back to what we were talking about a little while ago, is instituted as an interruptive practice, right? To the extent that the daily prayer interrupts our self-absorption and directs our thoughts to the other and the next other and the next other, infinitely extended, which we can even call God as a placeholder for that infinite extension of our obligation to serve the other, right? Ideally, that's how the prayer service works. And not to toot my own horn, but if you were to look at my book, Responsible Life, there's a section on the prayers in which I try to point out how, in fact, the original construction of the prayer service was meant to turn our attention from ourselves to the other, right? The genius of Judaism is to have created such a practice. The Achilles heel of Judaism is how easy such a practice can devolve into rote, so that I don't recognize why I'm doing it, right? The Mussar practice, in a way, is a support service, so to speak, to remind us of why we're doing those kinds of ritual actions. Now, to Todd's point, two things. When you say that Judaism has a practice and connecting it to the spiritual is a little bit iffy, well, that's precisely what I'm suggesting here in terms of what Marilyn said, right? Ideally, if you go to shul and you read and actually understand what you're saying and read the words and take them in, they will, in fact, point you in that spiritual direction, because the prayers are all about hearing your obligations to the other, right? There are, for example, 19 blessings in the middah, and most of them, certainly at least more than half, deal with the obligation to serve the poor, to do tshuva, to clothe the needy, etc. Right? So if you actually hear the words as you say them 3 times a day, then it would in fact be interrupting your self-absorption and pointing you into the spiritual service of the other. And let's just for a second, let's make sure we understand what spirituality means. Right? So in the way in which I define spirituality, right? Spirituality is the English term that is really used to understand what we mean by kedusha, by holiness. And holiness is spelled out very specifically in the book of Leviticus. And at the center of that Levitical holiness code is precisely, you shall be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy. Therefore, love your neighbor as yourself. So spirituality is functionally a continual consciousness of your obligation to love the other, to bear the other as your responsibility. Right? So if we understand spirituality as precisely that, then everything in Judaism points toward that level of spirituality. And then the final point you made, Todd, is a very interesting one. The tradition, in its genius, recognized that the action which human beings do more often than every other action is eating. And therefore, if eating could be used as a way to further this self-interruption and point us toward our obligation to serve the other, then we would be doing cheshbon hanefesh 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. Again, the problem is that it's so easy for the rituals that surround eating to devolve into rote, and therefore not to function in the way they were intended. And Mussar is, to a certain degree, an attempt to deal with the implicit potential for making Jewish ritual into a rote. So, in order to augment, right, to prepare our souls for those mitzvot to be effective, we have this, we've developed this practice, a daily discipline, right? Number one, to study Torah, right? This experience that we began today with, of joining ourselves to this ongoing conversation between people, even if they are separated by centuries, is a sine qua non. It's an absolute necessity from the point of view of Jewish practice, right? So we ask each of our students to find some piece of Torah, whether it's the Parsha or Pirkei Avot or the Mishnah in other ways, or even just reading a good Jewish history book, right? To join this conversation for 5 or 10 minutes a day, to have some aspect of Torah. Second, we've discussed before, to apply the midot through the process of cheshbon nefesh, right? And we'll look at that process a little bit more closely next time. But exactly how do we do cheshbon nefesh, we'll talk about next time. Practicing spirituality, by which we mean, right, cultivate our capacity to become calm and centered in order to gain an overarching vantage point on our lives and actions. Right? Each Mussar practitioner seeks a path into the traditional Jewish activity of avodah, divine service. Right? So this goes to the question that, the idea that Marilyn raised, or right, that as important as going to Minyan might be, and it is, what's more important is being consciously aware of what we're doing there, right? And then finally, taking on a mitzvah. So we ask all of our students to take on 2 mitzvot that they can, so that they can connect the practice of Mussar to the halachic tradition, right? One, an interruptive mitzvah, whether it's saying the Shema morning and evening or saying a blessing before you eat, some action which you can keep in mind as an interruptive action. And the other is an action of mitzvot ben adam lechavero, to take on one mitzvah of the what I call the instantiative branch, right? Those mitzvot which actually contain an ethical kernel, whether it's committing to be involved in feeding the sick or other kinds of things, visiting the sick rather, or feeding the poor, right? To work that into our lives as a discipline, right? We suggest that people commit by setting specific times to do this, including having some kind of morning ritual, whether it's by virtue of the traditional ritual or one that is more, let's say, liberal in terms of finding some space and time in the morning to think about these things. We suggest that people keep a commonplace book, a little notebook where you can put quotable passages from the reading that you're doing, that you can eventually use as a kind of ongoing source book of inspiration. Studying Torah, we've already talked about. Doing cheshbon nefesh, we've talked about. This is done daily, right? Okay. So those are the elements, the tools in the Mussar toolbook, right? Any questions or comments, complaints? Okay, and then finally, we suggest that people recognize that we can't do it alone, right? That Mussar is not practiced alone, that we join together in a group for text study if we can. We join together in a vod to do the work of the Cheshbon HaNefesh. We have a chavruta who helps us prepare for both the shiur and the vod, right? And then, of course, this talks about how to actually join a vod, but we don't have to go into that at the moment. Okay. Comments, questions, complaints, responses, reactions. Todd?
I'm just trying to connect this with the idea of flow. Because I understand, the idea is, okay, are we serving the other? And how do we interrupt that self-absorption, right? And I'm just trying to understand, is it self-absorption? And how does self-absorption relate to flow? Because it feels like that's one where one's losing track of time, because one is caught up in something larger, in that larger meaning and purpose. And so it feels like there's this strange kind of balance between being aware of things and yet not being aware of them to be able to move forward. And so I'm just struggling with that. So wondering what you think.
That's a very interesting question. And in order to answer it, I hope I have enough time. I'm going to describe how we define two other traditional terms that you're probably familiar with. One is Olam Hazeh, and the other is Olam Haba. Right? So normally, or conventionally, right, we understand the tradition talks about Olam Hazeh, and it refers to this world, and Olam Haba to the world to come, some kind of afterlife, most people would assume. We've transformed those terms, again, along what I would call existential lines, right? Olam Hazeh describes what happens when a person is trapped or chained to him or herself. Right? And Olam Haba describes what happens when one experiences the joy of serving the other. So this issue of flow that you bring up expresses the idea that we live in a world in which we can sometimes be trapped within ourselves. And that's a painful world, ultimately. Right? It's a world in which we are closed off, and therefore a lot of raw energy is generated. But Olam Haba is when we, in fact, allow this flow to proceed, and we experience a feeling of joy. And in that joyful feeling, we transcend time. Right? When we are trapped within ourselves, we're constantly counting minutes. But when we're serving the other, we are unaware of time completely. So
that really makes sense to me. I totally get it. I would just make one little emendation in the tradition, which is that experience of serving the other. That's 1/60th of Olam Haba.
Okay, I'll accept that. But in other words, you get what I'm saying, and that is that the whole process here that we're trying to cultivate is, in fact, to be able to live in that dimension of Olam Haba, even if it's 1/60th, as much as possible. Recognizing that sometimes we have to live in Olam Hazeh, that we have to close ourselves off in order to protect ourselves, in order to go to work, in order to earn a living, and all the other things that we have to do. And so, yes, the more we can cultivate an openness of nefesh, the more we experience the joy of Olam Haba. Okay, I think we're out of time. I hope we've made some sense today. And do you want to say something about materials?
I do, yeah. So I just want to thank you, Rabbi Stone, for today. I just to tell everyone, we are sending a follow-up email. The plan is Wednesday morning after this class. I've gotten some notes personally from people that they haven't received that email, and I'm curious to know, probably, and we don't talk about it, but it's not coming from me. It's coming from the synagogue. It's coming from our sort of email account. So it looks like a formed email, like a newsletter would look or something else. It's not actually coming directly from me. So please make sure you check your spam, because sometimes those types of emails have a tendency to hit the spam box. And if all else fails, I put the link in the side here where we're going to be putting the materials on the website. So hopefully we can all get the email thing worked out. But very worst case, the recordings are always online on YouTube and on the website. And the class materials will be at this link. So hopefully we can work that out, but that's the backup plan. Anything else, Rabbi Stone?
I think we're done.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and week.
Take care, everybody.
תודה רבה.